Hello well-wishers and welcome to my channel Aspiring Minds. In today's video, I present before you the Smart Study series on Kate Chopin's short story, The Story of an Hour. So grab your virtual seats and let's get started. In this video, we will discuss the story in details, the important events of the story and the significant themes that will help you in your upcoming ISC examination preparation. The story begins with the news of Mrs. Mallard's husband Brentley Mallard being killed in a train accident. Now Mrs. Mallard already has a heart condition, so her sister Josephine and her family friend Richards are very careful in delivering the news to her. On hearing the news of her husband's death, the initial reaction of Mrs. Mallard is that she starts crying and she retreats or goes to her room and she wants to spend time alone and feel sad about her husband's death. So her reaction seems very much expected because she dearly loved her husband. It is at this time that the story takes place and it is titled The Story of an Hour because this is the changing moment, the moment of transformation for Mrs. Mallard, because alone in her room she undergoes a lot of changes. She experiences a rush of different variety of emotions. She starts to feel a sense of freedom and liberation and a sense of joy instead of being sad at this time because of her husband's loss, and she realizes that she is now free and she is no longer bound within that bond of marriage, and she can be herself and live life to the fullest. So this is that 1 hour which has been captured by Kate Chopin, and therefore she has made the title of the story as The Story of an Hour. Now, after that inner transformation, that change that comes in Mrs. Mallard, there is a new perspective. She gets a fresh new outlook towards life. She thinks, she contemplates about her newfound freedom and the potential that is there in her to fulfill her own wishes and desires apart from her husband. And now she begins to look forward to a future without her husband, and she seems to be extremely happy and free to go ahead because she is now no longer bound in the chains and shackles of marriage. But the story is not so easy because at this time a twist happens in the story. Just as Mrs. Mallard starts to embrace her new life, Brentley Mallard walks through the front door unharmed, unaffected, having been nowhere near the accident. His return shocks and disheartens Mrs. Mallard. And what is the tragic or the sad ending? Mrs. Mallard's joy turns to shock and despair at the sight of her husband. Imagine someone who had been so happy, elated, energetic that her husband is no more going to interfere or be a part of her life appears once again. Her heart gives out and she collapses and dies, because remember, we saw in the beginning of the story, it was already mentioned that she was suffering from a kind of a heart condition, right? So her heart was, as it is, not capable of performing very strongly. So though she was able to absorb the initial shock of her husband's death because it was going to bring her happiness, this shock of him being alive is way greater. And the doctors conclude that she died of the joy that kills. So here the doctors think that she was so happy to see her husband return that she could not take in that happy news of her husband's return, and that is why she passed away. But we all know as readers of the story that the reality was actually something else. She did not die because of the shock of seeing her husband and she was so happy, but she knew that that freedom that she had experienced in that 1 hour alone in her room, and now she had made plans on how she would carry out her life freely, was once again slipping out of her life, and she would be once again bound in that weird, terrible life that her husband had given her. Now let us look at what are the important themes of the story of an hour. Female freedom and independence. The story explores the limited roles and the societal expectations placed on women in the late 19th century. Mrs. Louis Mallard's initial reaction to her husband's death is a sense of liberation, freedom, highlighting the theme of women's desire for independence and freedom from the constraints of marriage and societal norms. Next, repression and liberation. How there is a kind of a conflict between these two extremes. The story portrays the idea that women were often repressed and confined within the institution of marriage in the name of marriage, and Mrs. Mallard's brief moment of freedom and self-discovery illustrates the desire for liberation from these constraints. The story also explores the irony of life. The story is marked by dramatic irony, as Mrs. Mallard's initial reaction to her husband's death is one of joy and freedom, but her husband's return makes her die out of shock. This irony highlights the unpredictability of life and the unexpected twists it can take. Next, mortality and death. Now, death is obviously the central theme in the story. Mrs. Mallard's heart condition symbolizes her fragile, weak state and her eventual death, ironically brought on by the shock of her husband's return. And this in turn underscores the theme of mortality and unpredictability of life. Now, what was the role of society in this story? We see that the writer is critiquing the traditional roles and expectations which were imposed by the society, especially on women. And the story also is a classic example of emotional complexity because it explores the complex and contradictory nature of human emotions. Mrs. Mallard's emotional journey from grief to elation to despair illustrates the intricate, intertwined, shifting nature of human emotions and feelings, and indeed she was not able to have a complete control over them, which is why, despite her heart condition, she was not able to survive the death of the return of her husband. Isolation is a very important theme in the story because it is in that 1 hour when Mrs. Mallard shuts herself up in her room away from the societal expectations and pressures. It is then that she is able to reflect deeply, to think about her own desires and emotions and feel that elation and joy and liberation that she had been waiting for all her life. And it therefore helps her to build her self-identity because Mrs. Mallard's briefly, she experiences a sense of self-identity and prospect of living all by herself besides the role that she had to play all along as a wife. So we see that the story of an arp is a thought-provoking narrative that raises questions about the gender roles, societal constraints, and the complexities of human emotion. It is a concise yet a powerful exploration of these themes within the context of a woman's brief emotional journey. So that's it from this video. I hope you liked it. Do hit the like button, subscribe to my channel for more such future updates. Thank you for watching. Bye.